I'm going to start out this series with a patriotic quilt that I've called Americana Stars. As you know, many of the quilters in the past year have wanted to make a patriotic quilt, and this is the one that I've chosen to do for the series. When you look at the quilt, you'll see that we have the red, white, and blue patriotic theme, but I have changed out the white for a fabric with some gold overtones. Also, when you look at it, you'll see that the stars appear to have movement because I have twisted and turned them, and all of the points have some different angles to them, and I'll be showing you how to create that wonderful pattern a little later on in the program. You'll notice that I have placed the blocks, first of all the red ones are in a diagonal pattern, and then I've surrounded it with the blue and gold stars. And something that's very important when creating this quilt is after you get all your blocks done, you need to arrange them in the pattern that you want them before you start framing them so that you get them to twist and turn in the right angle. I think one of the most important fabrics that I chose when starting this quilt was the background fabric. It is the fabric that all of the stars are floating on, and then after you have chosen that fabric, then choose the rest of your fabrics for the blocks. When you look at each of the blocks individually, starting with the red one, you'll notice that it has the red background with the blue points and then the red square on point in the center. And then when you go over to the blue one, I have switched out the red points for the blue ones. And I tried to do that throughout all of the red and blue blocks. But then when I got to the gold ones, I decided to alternate the points with both the red and blue fabrics, just for a little different interest in the quilt. Then something else that I think is very important when it comes to the part of quilting the quilt, it's important to use a complementary quilting design to go with the actual quilt that you've made. And for this one, we've chosen to use the continuous line star pattern. Then in the bottom or in the corner of each, in the frame, in the corner of the quilt, you'll notice that there is a square on point which is repeated from the center of each of the stars. Next, I'd like to give you a close-up look of the block up on the flannel board here, and I want to show you how the templates actually fit into the pattern. Now, I mentioned earlier, I believe, that I used the Peaky and Spike template set to create this pattern, and all of the units, when they are completely sewn, go into a 4.5-inch square. And when I lay this up here, you'll see that the seam allowance is included. Then the piece that's really important in this pattern has the two different angles for the star, and again notice that it has the 1/4-inch seam allowance included in it. And then we have the point or the spike that goes off to the left, and then the little triangle that comes up here in the corner. This triangle is again repeated up in this part of the block, and it surrounds the square on point in the center of the quilt. Off to my right, you'll see another block, which is the gold one. And the difference between these two blocks is you'll notice that these points are a mirror image of this. And in the designing process of making this quilt, I thought that's what I wanted to do, was to alternate the points. But after I had a certain amount of them finished, I decided I wanted all of them to be the same. So when we start cutting, it's going to be important that all of our strips are cut and then the fabric doesn't have a fold in it so that I don't end up with a mirror image. Ahead of time, I have laid out some of my fabrics ready to be squared up on the mat board. And I have bifolded the fabric up on top of the mat board, and that way when I turn my board, it's not going to disturb my straightened fabric. So we'll first straighten up the edge over here. And I do all of my cutting with a rotary cutter. And when I'm teaching classes, I find that if a student has trouble with their rotary cutting, they're probably not holding it just right. And I like to suggest that they put their pointer finger up on top of the blade. That way it gives them more control when they're cutting. And I also like to use the small rotary cutter or the 28 millimeter when I'm doing all my cutting. Now I'm going to move the ruler over and match up the straightened edge of the ruler with the straight edge of the template. And it's also a good idea to take the template up to your block and make sure that you have laid it in the right direction. Now if I had gone this way, you see that I would have cut the pieces in the wrong way. So we'll cut it like this, and we'll line up the straightened edge of the fabric with the straight edge of the template. And I always check twice and then cut once. The first cut I make, I like to go backwards and then forward, and then I kind of crawl with my hand along the ruler. That way it's not going to slip, and so I don't have a mistake when I'm cutting. The next thing that I want to talk about is I've put fabric grips on the templates to keep them from sliding when I'm cutting. And now I need to make sure that I've got this laid right again. I must have disturbed it. There is the right way. Okay. We'll lay the template up on top of the fabric. Now if I had laid the template on the other way, I would have had a mirror image. And I think to make that point clear, I'll probably cut one so that you can see. Now I'm not going to tip the template like this, but I'll just move it along and follow the edge. Now to save fabric, I can go like this and just follow the straightened edge over here. And then we'll turn the board. Now I have, I'm not sure if it's 4 or 5 layers of fabric, but see, this is how, now if we were making the red block, see how that would fit in there? Now just to go back to that part where I said you would end up with a mirror image, I'm going to take a piece of fabric and fold it in half to show you how I would get that. What did I, oh, here it is. Now I have what's called the mirror image. So half of my stars would have been going the other way. And like I said in the beginning of the program, because I chose to have them all going the same way, you want to have all your fabrics laying face up when you're cutting your pieces. The other pieces then that you would cut would be the spike piece. And we can actually move that almost up there. And on this piece you really have no waste of fabric at all, because you can turn your piece like this and work your way across. And that would be the piece that would lay in here. The square on point, there's no special tricks about that one. You would just cut your strips, and the straight of grain actually follows right in here, so you don't have to do anything special with that one. But I want to show you how to cut the little pieces that go out in here. And before I do that, I'll move some of this out of my way. Now one thing about this quilt, it doesn't take a whole lot of fabric, so I would suggest that you probably purchase fat quarters of each of your patriotic fabrics that you wanted to use, because it really doesn't take that much. Now the little triangle that I'm going to use in the quilt has a 90-degree angle down here, and you want your straight of grain to be out here, and the bias edge is on the long edge. So again, I'll lay the template up on top of the ruler so I can see how wide to cut my strips. Check twice and cut once. Does that sound like I've made a mistake before? Probably. And now with this one, like I said before, you want the bias to be on the long part of the block. And then you'll turn. And with this method, you really have no waste of fabric. Plus, you really will enjoy the accuracy that you get cutting this way. Well, I think I'm ready now to go to the sewing machine and show you how to piece the block together. Ahead of time, I have laid out all of the pieces to make one of the blocks at the sewing machine, so it'll be ready for me to start sewing. I'm going to sew all of my pieces together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I like to use the open toe foot on the machine. That way I don't have an obstructed view when I'm sewing. I think one of the tricks in putting this quilt together is how do you lay your pieces right side together to end up with the perfect 4.5 inch square. I know that was a problem when I started piecing these units together, and I'm going to show you from the back side how much of the red. There's just a little bit of red showing up there, and because we have two unusual angles coming together, that's why you see that unusual shaped ear. And then down at the bottom side, where I will start sewing, the seam will start right on the crevice of that. I like to start sewing on an anchor cloth, and you'll notice that I have a stiletto in my hand, and I can guide the fabric right up to the point that I want to start sewing. And I have it on the pivot sensor system, so it's so easy to adjust your fabric when you're sewing. And notice how I check and recheck to make sure that my edges are lined up perfectly. And when I'm teaching a class like this, I always like to make sure that they have a stiletto in the hand so that they can guide the fabric to the very end of the seam. That way it prevents your seam from going one way or the other. Now I'm going to sew back off onto an anchor cloth. And I can notice right away that I have done something wrong because my seam allowance was too wide, and I had forgotten to set my sewing machine at the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I will re-sew a unit just like that with the correct seam allowance. Notice how this is too wide. Now, why is that important? The reason that I stress the 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is that you have to make up for the fabric used in the seam allowance, in the seam line. So I'm going to re-sew another unit and line them up like I did the first two pieces. Notice that I'm not doing any back stitching. Now with the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, my needle position is moved off to the right. Now if I hadn't moved or changed the seam allowance from the first piece, this would never end up to be a correct 4.5 inch unit. Now I'll sew back onto an anchor cloth. Now I will finger press that seam open, first of all, and then I will press it with an iron. And I like to keep the iron right next to me at the sewing machine so I don't have to hop up and go over to the big ironing board. And just give it a little press. And then we'll put the piece on in the corner to make it into that perfect square. We'll line it up, and this time you have an equal amount of ear on both sides. And this time the seam will start right in the crevice. And because I have it in the pivot, notice how I can slide my fabric right up into the intersection. And again, it ended in the crevice. The reason I like to use an anchor cloth when I'm piecing is that you have the stitches on the center part of your beginning of your patchwork are as strong as your center piece is sewn. Again, we will finger press that seam open, and then you would press it with the iron. And then the next thing that I like to talk about when we're putting the a unit together like this, and over here I have already pieced one, what you do is you lay your template down on top of the sewn unit to make sure that you end up with this perfect size piece. And we will square it up with a rotary cutter, trimming off any of the excess along the edge. That's how you get the perfect units that go into your patchwork. That gives you also a second chance to make a perfect quilt block. Then the next unit you would put together would be the square on point in the center, and to do that one you would first put a piece on each side opposite each other like this, and then one on each side of this, and again you would square it up with the square template in the center. And I think something that I should point out at this part is that you want the intersection to come exactly 1/4 of an inch from the edge, so that when you connect these two seams together you'll have perfect points on the right side. Up on the flannel board I have the units already put together for a red block, and I think I would like to show you next how to connect these two units together to get that perfect intersection right in here. So we'll put these two right sides together. And what we'll do is we'll put a pin right on the intersection where the seam came together through the top and then through the bottom. Snug it up. And I'm using silk pins. You don't want to use large pins when you're doing this because you want to have more precision in your sewing. And now we'll sew this intersection together. This is also a great quilt to use up scraps in. Some of you might have a lot of red, white, and blues left from last projects. Actually, the quilt gets better looking the more different fabrics that you use in it. So if you run out of one, just add another one. Okay, now we'll take a look at this intersection. We've got a perfect intersection. Press it with your first finger, press it, and then press it with the iron. And then you would continue to add the other pieces over here and connect all of the rows. Now up on the sewing machine off to my left, I have some rows already put together for the next stage. And we're ready to piece those now together, and I want to show you a neat little trick for matching up those intersections. And we'll turn this one around though. Okay, so we'll put these right sides together. One of the ways that I like to do this is to flip-flop those intersections so that they go in opposite directions, and then flip them both in the same direction after you have them matched up. And I put a pin right on the seam line and then open it up again. Now your pin is hidden inside of those two fabrics. We'll do it one more time. We'll first flip-flop the fabrics in opposite directions, and then holding it in place, we'll flip it back like this, insert a pin right there, and then flip this seam allowance backwards. And I won't take the time to sew the seam, but that's how I match them up. Now we'll take it to the next part, and I'll drop this down so that you can see what's happening up here on the main flannel board. You'll see that I've already got a couple of the blocks framed and they're twisting and turning. To do that method, what you do is you sew a 2.5 inch strip around the outside edge of the completed block. And notice how I left a little opening down here. What you do is you put the first strip on here and leave this open, then come on the top, the left side, and the bottom, and then you finish off this bottom edge down here, and you'll end up with a perfect framed unit. Now off to the front of the sewing machine, I have laid a template down. It's actually from the Home Deck pillow kit. It's a Home Deck template to make pillows, but it works out perfect for quilting as well. And what I have done is lined up the 14-inch line on the quilted square, and that's how I get this unusual twist and turn. To make it a little easier to start out with, I matched up the circle in the center to the outside edge of that square on point, and then just twisted it a little bit so that each of the corners of the 14-inch square came on one of my seam lines. Then after you've done the marking with that, and I want to mention that it's important to use the same pencil every time you mark one of these, because the size of your thread might vary a little bit, and that would make a difference in the size of your finished cut block. After you have marked that off, then you cut the frame on the mark, and that's how you end up with the twist and turn. And I think it's a really fun way to get movement into the quilt. And for those of you that have tried to put quilt blocks together with many different people sewing the blocks, this way you can save your quilt by twisting and turning your blocks.